Hi everybody. This lecture will be on Blaise Pascal and Pascal's wager. Pascal lived in the 1600s and was a French mathematician. And it's important to note that he was also a Catholic philosopher. He was one of the first uh, philosophers to deal with and utilize probability theory. And it's a bit interesting that Pascal was a bit of a gambler at his young age. And this might be where we get some of his philosophy for the existence of God. And so, what Pascal tries to do in the wager is essentially explain why we ought to believe that God exists. He doesn't necessarily make an argument for the existence of God, but instead makes an argument for why we should believe. Pascal thinks that when we're posed with this question of whether or not God exists, we can't use reason to make any kind of clear decision. Pascal doesn't think that we can reason God's existence. But by that same token, he doesn't believe we can reason that God doesn't exist. So essentially, we have to bet on God's existence from a non-rational perspective and take a different position or set of reasons for why we ought to believe. And this, Pascal says, is something that we're forced into. Most instances when we bet on something, whether I bet on a sports game or I bet that an election is going to turn out a certain way, I'm always free to not make the bet if I don't want. I can bet whether or not the Chargers will beat the Browns, or I can bet whether the Padres will beat the Yankees. But I can also withhold my bet, decide not to bet if, let's say, the odds aren't in my favor or I'm just unsure of what the odds are. Pascal, however, says with the existence of God, we're forced into this bet. There is no abstaining from betting. You either bet that God exists or you don't. Withholding from the bet or abstaining from betting is your betting that God doesn't exist. And so we're forced to make a decision whether or not we believe in God's existence or not. Now, with this wager comes 4 outcomes or 4 consequences to our bet. If God exists and we bet against God's existence, meaning that we take an atheist position or even an agnostic position, and it turns out that God doesn't exist, then we have lost a lot. This is essentially an instance of not believing in God and from it suffering eternal damnation in hell. If God doesn't exist and we bet against it, so again taking the atheist or agnostic position, or betting against the non-Judeo-Christian God, then we don't lose much at all, right? Because if God doesn't exist, then nothing really happens. There is no hell. And we don't really get anything out of that by not believing and God not existing. Now compare these two outcomes with the two outcomes of God's existence. If God exists and we bet for God's existence, we have gained everything. And if God doesn't exist and we bet for God's non existence, then we've gained nothing. So, for instance, if God does exist and I believe in God and follow the tenets of Christianity, Judaism, then I'll be rewarded with entrance into heaven. If I believe in God, but God doesn't exist, then I haven't really gained or lost anything, right? Maybe I've lost a few Sundays that I went to church. Um, maybe I donated money to a church, but nothing really that put me in financial turmoil. And so it wouldn't be necessarily clear that by believing in God and God not existing, that I lose out on a whole lot. I mean, my life is pretty much going to exist as it does. Whether or not God exists is not going to radically change my morals to the point where if I think that God doesn't exist, I'm going to go out and steal and murder a bunch of people. For the most part, I'm going to exist according to the framework of the law, of what I feel is right and wrong. And so, if God doesn't exist, I'm not losing a whole lot by being religious. But remember, if God does exist, then I gain everything, an entrance into heaven. And so, when it comes down to betting on whether or not God exists, Pascal is going to say that the benefits far outweigh the losses. Because if God exists, we want to get the infinite gain of heaven, so we should live a life of virtue and believe in God. Because there is no downside to believing in God. Either you go to heaven if God exists, or you have maybe a slightly less exciting life if God doesn't exist and you don't go to heaven. But even that slightly less exciting life doesn't compare to an eternity in hell if I don't believe that God exists when he does. So if you look at the diagram, it seems as though the best option is to assume that God exists and live a life of virtue, because the gains far outweigh the losses. The best you can do if you think that God doesn't exist and you live this kind of life of debauchery is to just have maybe a slightly more fun life. Again, even this understanding is a bit odd to suggest that somebody who is not religious has a more exciting or fun life than somebody who is religious. So there's not much to gain by believing that God doesn't exist. If anything, you are risking the eternal loss of being in hell. So it would make sense that we should just believe that God exists. And so this is the wager that Pascal's asking us to make, and it's essentially a bet that by betting one side, you essentially can't lose. So Pascal would believe that it would be completely irrational to not bet on God because of just the weight in gains versus losses. Based on this wager, Pascal is saying it would be foolish to bet against God. We should bet for God and God's existence. Now, there are objections to this idea. 3 that we're going to talk about here. The first is that believing in God for a self-serving reason, such as to get into heaven, seems to be the wrong reasons for believing. It seems as though we're just being selfish by saying, we want the reward, so we'll believe whatever it takes to get that reward. This doesn't really seem to hold up when you look at Judeo-Christian scripture. Typically, one would believe in God because one actually in their heart believes that God exists. Believing in God for some self-serving reason seems to miss the mark. The next objection is that Pascal's wager doesn't necessarily get us to believe in the Christian God, the Judeo-Christian God. Essentially, Pascal is saying we should bet on God because of the promise of the afterlife. But many different religions promise an afterlife. And because we can't reason one way or another whether God exists, we simply just have to bet. And if that's the case, why is it the Judeo-Christian God the one that we're betting on? Why don't we bet on Hindu gods or Greek gods? The last objection is that just because we want to believe in something, does that mean we can? If I wanted to believe that the earth was flat, I couldn't just snap my fingers and all of a sudden think, oh, the earth is flat. Right in my head, I know that the earth is round. And so trying to change that belief is not something that I can do at the flip of a switch. I don't have the voluntarism to essentially change my beliefs at any whim, especially one about religion for, going back to the first objection, a self-serving reason. So if I'm suggesting, oh wow, looking at that diagram on the previous page, it makes more sense to believe in God than not to believe in God, I should just believe in God. Okay, but can I just start believing in God? It doesn't seem as though it's that easy. There are a few counter objections to this idea, though. Perhaps on that last point, that I can't actively change the things I believe. Recent studies in the philosophy of mind have really danced around the idea that we can change our beliefs. And we do it all the time. Our beliefs change as we grow up. Our beliefs change as we learn new things. Our beliefs can even change when we're simply indoctrinated into an organization or social structure such as going to church or being part of an organization. There's a very popular phrase, fake it till you make it. And there is some truth to this. We've seen this with psychological studies about identity scripts, where the more one is surrounded by people who believe certain things, the more one simply goes about pretending that something is the case, after a while, they will start to become that person. They will start to believe those things. So for somebody who goes to church, maybe by going to church and being part of a men's or women's group, by donating to the church and volunteering for the church, perhaps by simply just surrounding yourself in that society, it will lead to an eventual belief in your heart that God does exist. Another objection might be that perhaps it's not necessarily God that we're focusing on, but more of having a good life in order to win favor with God or other gods. If being a good person is essentially enough, then regardless of the beliefs, right, or being able to force myself to believe in God, if I act in such a way, that may be enough. So, for instance, if I want to believe in God but can't force myself to believe in God, perhaps I should just act according to the Ten Commandments, according to Scripture and how Jesus acted, and simply by doing the actions and living this good life, I can somehow win favor with God. And perhaps this could also allow me to win favor with other gods as well. So if it were true that the Hindu gods were the gods of the world, then again, not knowing which god to choose or to believe in, I simply just live a good life, being kind to others, being helpful. And that might get me to win favor with the Hindu gods. And so what Pascal is doing here is essentially giving us reason to believe, but not necessarily making an argument for the existence of God. And there seems to be something to this. Playing the odds and determining, based on a set of outcomes, what makes most sense. Now again, whether or not simply playing the odds is good enough is unknown. But it would seem as though if we weren't able to determine rationally whether God existed or didn't, it would seem as though what would make the most sense is to believe, or at least try to believe, that God exists.